If I had been a Republican in the same circumstance, knowing I would be excommunicated in a really nasty way, I still would have done it.
Yeah, sure.
But I think it's worth pointing out that that is not how the Democratic Party and caucus operates. And we do create space and place for dissent. I know a lot of Republican colleagues who, in their hearts, want Donald Trump to lose so that this sickening chapter in American political history can come to a close and they can rebuild the party, hopefully, with principled conservatives leading the charge.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Miller, bringing back to the show conquering hero, Democratic Congressman from Minnesota, Dean Phillips. He was an entrepreneur. He helped to build the Talenti Gelato into one of the top-selling ice cream brands in the country, and he made some pretty good points about the 2024 election that you may or may not remember. How are you doing, Congressman?
I'm doing great, Tim. Thank you. Doing a lot better than I was doing when we last spoke.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think you were doing fine. It was maybe me that wasn't doing well. I love being wrong. I know people don't believe this about me because of my, brash attitude, but I love being wrong. I love saying I'm wrong. I just don't like it when I'm right and you tell me I'm wrong. That's the problem. But in this case, I was wrong. And to prove it, I want to listen to Dean Phillips, August 13th, 2023, 1 year ago, 367 days ago, before you announced you were running, when you're kind of soft floating that something needed to happen here. Here you are with Chuck Todd on Meet the Press.
What I'm technically and legitimately doing is representing. I'm a representative, and I'm representing what I believe to be the majority of the country that wants to turn the page. Tired of the meanness and the fear-mongering of Donald Trump. I would like to see Joe Biden, a wonderful and remarkable man, pass the torch, cement this extraordinary legacy.
You don't want him to run for re-election.
I believe what's in the best interest of the country. And by the way, this is not how everybody thinks, but I do believe a majority wants to move on. I hear from way too many people. Now, the news was that I was meeting with donors. The fact is, I listen to normal Americans every day and my own feeling.
Is this all about age?
No, this is about how people feel. By the way, it's not about what's real all the time. It's about how people feel. People want to turn the page. Mm-hmm. I think that's fair to say. As a Democrat, I adore Joe Biden. He saved this country. He can cement his legacy. My real call to action right now is not about me. The call to action is to ask the president to pass the torch.
What can President Biden do to reassure you he is up to a second term?
I'm not saying he's not up to a second term. What I'm saying is look at the data. I listen. My job is to listen. I do it every single day back in Minnesota.
Right. Can he change the data? Case against what you're talking about is basically the history of our lifetimes. OK, you go back the last four sitting presidents who had serious primary challengers. That party lost the White House.
But Chuck,
why did they? We can go back to LBJ, but also Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush.
But why were they primaried? Because people recognized they were weakened. The country was ready to turn the page.
Well, how do you grade yourself on that, Congressman?
I'd say B+.
B+? What'd you get wrong?
I have not heard that, by the way, for a long time, Tim, and it's even interesting for me to hear those because I've been consistent since the very beginning. And if I got anything wrong, I believe I didn't work hard enough and perhaps aggressively enough with those in the positions of power that had the levers available to pull to do something sooner. And if I have any regret, it's not that what I did. It's not about what I did. It's what I didn't do, and that is to perhaps inspire Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and others that ultimately were the brokers, if you will, to do something sooner. That's probably my only regret.
Who really thinks you were right? When I was listening to that audio a couple times the last 24 hours, I was like, who really should have listened to Dean Phillips? It wasn't me. It was Gavin. You got to believe Gavin's sitting out there in Sacramento right now going, man, I really, this guy had some points that maybe I should have thought a little more.
Yeah. Tim, I saw the governor in South Carolina when I was campaigning. Yeah. And we appeared at the same event, and he did his shtick, and then I did mine. I gave him a hug afterwards, and I whispered in his ear, "You should have fucking run." And at that moment, a photographer snapped a picture. I have it on my. It's one of those moments where only he and I knew what I had just said, but he smiled in a way that said a lot.
Turned out great, actually. Not by anybody's strategic doing, but by dumb fucking luck.
You know what, Tim? Hey, having good luck is much better than having good strategy.
That's true. But I want to go forward, but just a little bit more going back to that time. I'm curious. I'm mostly curious about, because I just think any institution as a culture, it is good to listen to people that are challenging you in good faith from internally, right? It's good to listen to question your presumptions. It's good to let whistleblowers speak, right? Like all of this, like that is all a sign of health, and it's positive. And I think the most distressing thing about all this was that was not really what happened initially on the Democratic side. There's a lot of wagon circling, and I'm just curious, like, what was the hardest part for you about that process? Like, how bad did it get? How ostracized were you? Are you still disillusioned a little bit by some of your colleagues' behavior?
Well, let me start with the positive, which is I'm overjoyed and frankly amazed that that mission that was such a lonely one for so long has been realized. And it was never about accolades and public roses being thrown at me. It was about doing the right thing. And I feel I did the right thing. So I don't have resentment. I don't have anger. Many have asked me to go on a "I told you so" tour, and that's just so antithetical to what this was all about. So I'm optimistic too.
You're a better man than I. You're a better man than I on that front. I would literally have an "I told you so" tattoo right now. I'd have that mission accomplished banner from W. I'd have done a speech on a boat.
Look how that turned out for him. And that's the MO in Washington. And I wanted to do this differently. And I'll wrap that in a bow. I'm just overjoyed that it finally happened. Should it have happened sooner? Yes. Most sad, I have to say, is had Joe Biden debated me and perhaps others in the primary, and campaigned a little bit, I think the country would have seen those elements that ultimately led to him standing down. And the fact that he actually appeared at that June 27th debate, that I believe, unfortunately and sadly, history will look upon as the end of his career. He could have saved his own legacy, and I really hold those around him more accountable than anybody. So if I have any disappointment, to be honest with you, Tim, I'm really disappointed in those who had the power, the ability, the influence, and the trust of the president to do what's right, not just for the country, but frankly, as a human being, for him. So if I have any disdain, it is for those who could have done that. As for my colleagues, look, Tim, you and I know, we both know this game. And we know that it's a culture that focuses on self-preservation. It means you have to modify sometimes your values and principles if you wish to continue to be reelected. And that is, I think, the root of so many problems in Washington. So I knew what I was getting into. I didn't ask anybody for support because I knew they couldn't give it to me. And I don't have disappointment in the people. I have disappointment in the culture and in leadership. And that's why I'm hopeful that we can change that and reward, to your point earlier about whistleblowers or those of positions of dissent. We need to create a culture where you can do that respectfully and that people are willing to listen. The whole point of primaries, I mean, that we wouldn't, if we wanted to just coronate candidates based on who a party wants, we didn't need primaries. We didn't have them for many years. The whole point of a primary is to entertain ideas, entertain new candidates, to afford American voters at least an opportunity to get to know someone different. And when a party suppresses that, I think that is a threat to democracy. And look, I love my Democratic Party. I do believe our heads and hearts are in the right place. But I really think that we have to do some self-reflecting on what happened. And not, by the way, not just to me, to Marianne Williamson, to other candidates whose names probably most listeners won't ever know. I do believe we should work harder to promote competition, promote disparate voices. And by the way, I think Democrats will do better electorally if we do. I think we've unfortunately developed a brand that cancels and that disenfranchises and that suppresses. And I think the best way to overcome mean speech is with more speech. And that's just my principle. And I really hope we do some self-reflecting.
I think the additional thing that I'd add to that is, listening back to the Chuck Todd interview, I think the thing that you get the A+ for, the thing that you were the most right about was talking about listening to what regular people wanted, right? And there was this very cynical argument that was being made in Washington that it was like it was only elites that wanted Joe Biden to step aside. when it was the opposite was true, right? It was the elites that were protecting him. It was the most political obsessives, like probably political podcast listeners. So no offense to anybody listening to this, right? But it's like people that were that are the most, kind of focused on the winning a game element of this, right? Like that who are the most into politics as sports, that that I think were a little bit blinded, and it was like the people that were furthest away this whole time that were seeing things more clearly, right? And a lot of those were Democratic voters, not the types of Democratic voters that are like maybe the most vocal on social media.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and in fact, I think it's an analogy to Trumpism, which is when regular, everyday Americans, which is most Americans, feel that they're unheard or that their perspectives are not being considered or they have no recourse. It's just fundamental human nature that you become angry. It's true in a personal relationship. It's true in a professional environment. It's certainly true in politics. And Democrats used to be the party of the people, represented rural Americans, small town, working people. And we had our ears to the ground. Polling and data, which is foundational in Washington, D.C., those are numbers. You got to get into coffee shops and go to church and encounter people on the street to really understand what's going on. And I think if more people would do that, Tim, you'd find a couple things. People are not being heard. The Washington bubble is far more fierce and impenetrable than people even imagine. And the other, this is the good and the optimistic part, is the country is not nearly as divided as human beings as angertainment would have us believe. So there's a real truth to that. And I'm saddened that Democrats have abandoned a lot of this country. If you look at it geographically, when I say abandoned, just electorally, it's been pragmatism. But that was part of my call to action too, is to start listening, not reading numbers, to listen to people, for gosh sakes. That's what representative democracy is all about. Republicans, at least Trump, has done that better. I'm just going to have to give him a check mark in that box because he has been listening to people and he's giving that life. He's not the disease, he's a symptom of a disease. And the disease, I think, is a lack of listening, plain and simple. And that's what I was hearing. And it was obvious. I come from a district, Tim, as you know, that had not elected a Democrat since 1958. And I would have thought that maybe people would have paid a little bit of attention to a district like mine that is well-educated, prosperous, had been read for 60 years, and had something to say. And people were telling me loud and clear. And if you don't listen, you can't lead.
Yeah. There's one element in there that was the one area where I don't give you an A from the whole process, which is I do think that the Democratic voters, at least, were potentially looking for somebody that they thought could take on Trump more strongly. Yeah. And look, I'm happy to give, people who disagree with me credit when they get something right. I don't, is Trump listening, or is he a megalomaniac that just just wants the best applause? And is that a category difference? Is that a category difference from actually listen? I don't think that he's listening to dissenting views. I don't think that he's listening to marginalized groups. I don't think he's listening to, the women, trans people that are upset with his rhetoric, right? There's a certain group of people that cheers when he tells them what they like to hear. That's a little bit different than listening.
Well, let me rephrase. First of all, two things can be true at once. Yes, he's an egomaniacal disaster. And no, he does not listen to dissent, but I do believe, look, Tim, I think it goes without saying, he tapped into something that few recognized in the very beginning. And that's why all of us dismissed him when he walked down that staircase in whatever it was, 2014, 2015, because we thought he was a fool. But I do believe when it comes to bread and butter, kitchen table economics, when it comes to, the border issue, when it comes to disenchantment with the political system, even his opening slogan, which was "Drain the Swamp," there are very few more unifying slogans, I think, for most Americans than that one, because we all know that there is a real disconnect between Washington and everyday Americans. So the only credit I wish to give him is that he identified, I think, an undercurrent of disdain and tapped into it and then embellished it and has, frankly, destroyed, I think, the blessing of what he was doing. So you're absolutely right. That was not my point. My point is, Democrats have to start walking the talk, and this whole elite, it has become, I think, a party that has elevated too many. First of all, elite's a weird word, but elitism to me is simply people who are operating in a bubble who think they know better than others. And when it comes to electoral politics, the whole point is it's not about elites. It's about popularity. And there's a massive disconnect. It's just as simple as that. We got so much going for us, and it should never have been a close race to begin with. That's my whole point.
Yeah.
And listening, representation begins with listening, plain and simple.
All right. I want to talk about how Democrats can do better at this going forward, but just one more thing, if you'll indulge me. I'm not a huge fan of Thomas Sowell, but he does have one quote that's a winner, which is the people will forgive you for being wrong, but they'll never forgive you for being right. And so I am curious. I want to go back to the cafeteria one more time, just because I can't. I'm an inveterate. I'm gay. I'm an inveterate gossip. I like a little gossip. So how's the cafeteria? How was the cafeteria? Have you been back? Like how's everybody? Yeah. They're nice to you. Are they whispering behind your back? Are you getting some begrudging congrats?
It was a journey. I was told right before I threw my hat in the ring, someone reminded me of the old saying, Dean, first they're going to ignore, and then they're going to laugh, and then they're going to excoriate you, and then they're all going to say, we knew it all along. and I got to tell you, it was exactly how it played out. And yeah, it was when I came back to Washington after 5 months on the road campaigning. Yeah, I will confess, I don't get too nervous or concerned or fearful of social situations, but I'll confess, it was a strange feeling coming back to my community, to the Democratic caucus. And I remember walking in the chamber for the first time when I was back, and I happened to come through the Republican side, going over to my side, and I was greeted by a lot of hugs and handshakes and high fives. And a reporter tweeted immediately from the gallery, said, Dean Phillips returns to the chamber after 5 months, greeted with handshakes, high fives, and hugs, period. And then it said, from Republicans.
I remember this tweet. Yeah. I don't remember who sent it, but I remember seeing it.
And there's no question, Tim, that I was greeted with a lot more fanfare and affection by Republicans at that moment than I was by my own. And I understood why, because they knew what would happen to any one of them if they even whispered something negative about Donald Trump. So they saw me as someone who had done something courageous. My community on the other side of the aisle was still very disappointed. They thought I'd undermined Biden. They thought, they thought, if anything, that I was a problem, not prescient. And my dear friends were cool, and I think people were friendly, but it was hard. It was hard, and it hasn't been the same since, because I think it was fair to say I was relatively popular, elected to House leadership and the like. But in the last month, it has all changed. And a lot of people have come up to me proactively and very thoughtfully to share their kind words. The only people that haven't are the handful that I really think should. And those are the ones that said publicly disparaging things, which is only a handful of people. But Tim, it wasn't about accolades. Right. I knew my career would probably end.
If you just want to send me a little black book, we can do it off the record, a private list of who was nice to you the whole time, and then who was mean. I'll keep it as a note for the future.
Okay, I'll think of you this holiday season.
Thank you. I like that. Yeah, the naughty and nice list. All right, let's go. Let's look forward. You mentioned how Democrats have struggled reaching out to rural America in particular. Mm-hmm. You have a Minnesota colleague now that's on the ticket with Kamala Harris, Tim Walz. A lot of Democrats are saying that he is somebody that's suited to that. He comes from a farm community in Nebraska, was a coach in Mankato, which is rural-ish, and represented a rural district. So what are your thoughts about Tim Walz, the person, and then thoughts on whether he can maybe help bridge some of those problems you've identified?
I think Kamala Harris's choice of Tim Walz is outstanding. I love Tim Walz. I think he is exactly, he's the kind of guy that Tim Ryan has been begging Democrats to elevate, I think, for a long, long time. And I'm thrilled. And I really do believe that America is starting to see, what we Democrats can be and who we are, and what our life experiences can bring to the table. He's outstanding. Between being born in Nebraska, a teacher, a football coach, a National Guardsman, a relatively moderate representing a red district in Congress, and now, of course, a governor who has certainly moved left in his tenure here in Minnesota, but really did what Democrats, I believe, stand for, which is to raise the foundation, to invest in communities and people and education and social safety nets and paid family leave and the environment, has maintained women's reproductive rights against some odds, he's really an outstanding man, and I'm thrilled, and I do believe he's exactly the kind of Democrat that we should be elevating, and almost antithetical to this elitism that is assigned to both the West and East Coast that I think has really undermined us for some time. And I think in no small part, it's not just Kamala Harris's rise in the last few weeks that is really troubling Donald Trump. I think he sees in Tim Walz and this combination even a bigger threat, because I think they're, in a way, doing that listening and doing that rapprochement, if you will, with rural Americans better than he is. And I think Tim Walz has a lot to do with it. And as Americans get to know him, I think they're going to like him even more.
So I'm encouraged to hear that, because the Tim Walz thing has not sent the thrill up my leg that it has with a lot of folks. I think he seems like a really good person, and I love that he's contributed to his community. The thing that worries me a little bit is his time as governor. He was just a down the line progressive. We had Peter Callahan, who I'm sure has covered you in the past from Minnesota, Min Post, on the podcast last week, and I asked him, was there any time when he was governor that he said no to the progressive activists or said no to the left? And the answer was basically no. There was a couple small, certain situational caveats to it, but and so I do worry about that. Can somebody that is down the line progressive kind of effectively reach out to red America in the way that I think a lot of Democrats, including you, hope that he can?
Well, the best way I can answer this question is to reflect on, again, this political culture that almost requires, in this day and age, a governor, a member of Congress, a senator, to really abide by the company line, by the party line, if you will, if you wish to continue your career and ascend the ladder. And that is the culture. And people do have to make choices. The more independence you show, the less, there's an inverse correlation. The more independent-minded you are, the more willing you are to push back on occasion, the less likely you are to be celebrated by the party and ascend the ranks and find higher office. So that's the reality. And I think that's why we see so many electeds around the country change, modify their behaviors and their policies based on pragmatism. You're going to see the same thing, I think, from Kamala Harris right now. The times beg for a different approach. In 2020, she had to move away from her prosecutorial background, from her more moderate credentials. Now she's going to run back to them. I think she and Tim Walz are actually, at heart, much more moderate and pragmatic and common sense than perhaps their recent voting records and policies would have people believe. I think there's truth to that. There have been examples where Tim Walz pushed back. There was an episode recently with Uber and Lyft, and
this was one that Peter mentioned.
Yeah, rideshare services where I spoke with the governor. It was going to be a tragic decision by the Minneapolis City Council if this policy went through, which would have literally Uber was going to leave the Twin Cities market, and hundreds of people that rely on Uber every day to get to work, and so many people would have been stranded. And the governor did push back at great political risk here in Minnesota on that policy. He has done that on a few occasions. I think that's the most probably high profile. But I hear what you're saying. And that is true on both sides of the aisle. It's true on ours. But at the end of the day, I do think at heart he understands pragmatism. He understands he's not just representing Minnesota now, which is still blue. He's going to be representing an entire country. And that means he's, I think, going to be much more authentic about his more moderate centrist credentials. Time will tell. But again, we do not live in an era, Tim, where the political parties afford a lot of space for occasional pushback. Perfect example right here in front of you. So there you have it.
Have you talked to him since he got the nod?
I have not spoken. He's probably been a little bit busy, but yes, we've corresponded, and I have great effect. Tim and we've kind of come up here in Minnesota together. I hired a number of his staff members, his chief of staff, his deputy chief, his legislative director. And I think, and no one's asked me this question, but I can speak to the kind of people with whom Tim Walz surrounds himself. My former campaign manager is one of his top political directors now too. He really does select outstanding, high character, principled people around him of integrity and decency and competency. They're not flashy. They're not necessarily Ivy Leaguers. They're really good, solid people. That I found to be exceptional for me as well. He's that kind of guy. He's trustworthy. He's reliable. He's taken some heat about a couple things that I really think are absurd, but that's how politics work.
His military record and that bathroom thing.
Yeah. So military record. I mean, goodness, the guy served for 24 years in the National Guard.
Yeah.
I mean, who is anyone to throw stones at that, for gosh sakes? And he did not leave. He did not abandon, his guys, knowing he's going to be deployed. He ran for office, and circumstances worked out in a fashion that only political hit jobs would take advantage of. That's just the truth, and I think it's really shameful for those who would use that against him. But that's again the error, and not to mention against a guy who avoided the draft 4 times or 5 times in Vietnam, saying that his feet were frickin' flat. So come on,
I love hearing that about his staff. Have one of them email me. I need your help. This is helping. I'm getting Walz pilled. It's it's going a little slower for me. I'd love to hear more from the people that
I'd welcome that opportunity. And I should say, and I'm not going to be. I'll be totally honest. Tim
Please.
Did say a couple things about me publicly when I declared my candidacy that bothered me, and I let him know it. And we did what you're supposed to do. We discussed it and resolved it and moved on. So it's not like we've had a perfect relationship.
Yeah.
I've been disappointed on a couple of things, but I'm telling you, I think he's going to add value in ways that rarely vice presidents in campaigns do, particularly because of his adversary being J.D. Vance. I think he's really well suited to demonstrate real chops.
Yeah, that is that's a compelling endorsement. I know that we're here. We're supposed to be, doing the not just throwing stones at how terrible the other party is, but the Republicans are just like there's too many targets here, and I would be remiss if I did not ask you about the Republican nominee for Senate in your state of Minnesota. I just want to play a very short montage of Royce White. This man is the Republican nominee for Senate in Minnesota.
Well, look, let's just be frank. Women have become too mouthy. As the black man in the room, I'll say that.
The first time I started my campaign at the Federal Reserve, they said that I was a debt hawk and that I was, dog whistling anti-Semitism because I was at a place where a lot of Jewish elites actually run the Fed. Bernanke, and there's a long list of them.
But everybody wants to be LGBTQ positive because it's in, because it's funny, because the white folks will give you money. The white folks will accept you now if you're LGBTQ positive. But let me ask you this. Is there anything positive about a school, a group of liberal white women, taking a bunch of kids to a gay nightclub in Duluth, Minnesota, and having a drag queen stripper show?
I mean, what's happening? How is that the nominee for Senate?
First of all, my reaction, of course, it's despicable, shameful, moronic, but it's also more than anything else, it's just sad. It's really sad. It's sad for him. It's particularly sad for the Republican Party. I can't imagine what it must feel like, probably better than I, what it must feel like for a principled conservative to see some of the candidates that are being elevated right now. It's staggering. It's sad. It's embarrassing for a state in which I've made my home my whole life, and which I love, that has actually a very proud tradition of moderate conservatism. People like Dave Durnberger and Arnie Carlson, former governor.
Yeah, I love Arnie Carlson.
Arnie's a man who helped me considerably in my first. He and Walter Mondale tag team to really help me in 2018. I just think they would be turning. Well, Arnie's, of course, alive. Dave Durnberger passed away. They'd be turning in their graves. Ronald Reagan. I mean, I don't know how to respond to such absurd, sickening, grotesque commentary. And it's pathetic. Amy Klobuchar is going to demonstrate how most Minnesotans are in their hearts and heads. And I think I'm just going to leave it at that. And, not to mention, this is a guy who spends campaign dollars in strip clubs, for gosh sakes.
Come on.
And also, it's sad.
We've spent a lot of the time talking about how maybe Democrats could have been more open to your critique as an understatement. But I do notice you're still there, and that's the other thing that's frustrating as a principled somebody from the center right is like, Liz Cheney, you didn't get the Liz Cheney treatment, right? I mean, like these people have been run out on a rail.
Yep.
Adam Kinzinger, and they're being replaced with fucksticks like that guy, and it's just pretty depressing.
Let me speak to, if I could just say one, because I think this is really important. That is a huge difference. First of all, I would have done this if I had been a Republican in the same circumstance, knowing I would be excommunicated in a really nasty way. I still would have done it.
Yeah, sure.
But I think it's worth pointing out that That is not how the Democratic Party and caucus operates. And we do create space and place for dissent. Our progressive wing, our moderate wing, are pretty regularly in some degree of debate and conversation with differences of opinion, and there's space and place for it. Hakeem Jeffries is an outstanding leader, and I was at his table as a leader. He knew what I was up to. I kept him apprised. He did not support it, but he made place for it. And when I first offered to leave the leadership team because I was starting to raise my voice, he actually asked me to stick around. Didn't accept my resignation. And only when I came back to him many weeks later and basically said it wasn't a conversation, it was an advisory, did he accept it? But that is a difference. And I think if I'd ran again, I would have won handily, is what I believe. So this is not the same party as the other side. And we're in a better place to actually start investing in a little bit more of that, whereas the Republican Party is going to have to, I think, burn it down before they can even begin to. And I can tell you, I know a lot of Republican colleagues who, in their hearts, want Donald Trump to lose so that this sickening chapter in American political history can come to a close and they can rebuild the party, hopefully, with principled conservatives leading the charge.
Yeah, I don't really care what's in their hearts, but you're probably right about that. One more thing on the iconoclasm, then I want to hear what's next for you. I'm just hoping the thing we have both parties are doing their economic rollouts this week, and there's some good stuff in what Kamala's proposing. I like the child tax credit expansion. Yeah. It seems like they're going to propose more housing, which is a bugaboo that I've had, but neither of them are taking it all serious. Like just looming debt crisis we're facing with high interest rates, payments on debt service are skyrocketing. Are there any Dean Phillips out there to be the iconoclast on this issue? Because it's looking pretty bleak.
Tim, I think it's our biggest deficiency right now. Neither Kamala Harris nor Tim Walz have any private sector experience. I think the Democratic Party would be well served by starting to engage more deeply in fiscal responsibility and management. And debt services, both for consumers and for the federal government, is becoming a big problem. People should know that our debt service this year will probably exceed $850 billion. It's going to match our defense budget, and we're on a completely unsustainable path. And now we have consumers facing very similar challenges, especially those that took out 3-5-year ARMs to buy homes not long ago and are going to see interest rates just their payments explode. The good news is I think the Fed will be cutting rates soon, but I do believe Democrats should elevate this issue. And a policy that I promoted heavily, and I really hope that Vice President Harris and Governor Walz consider, is something called American Dream Accounts, in which the federal government would endow a $5,000 investment account for every baby born in America, be invested in a S&P 500 index fund, compound year after year after year, and then as an incentive to graduate high school, young Americans would have those accounts vest, and they'd have $20,000 to $25,000 to begin their lives. And this would be part of the Social Security program. Right now, we only take care of people at the end of their career. This would be help at the beginning of a career. And I think it's the kind of policy that would allow us to reduce social safety nets, afford young people some cash to begin their lives, start a small business, make a down payment on a house, and most importantly, truly afford all Americans equal opportunities. And it would cost $18 billion a year, which is about what California spends just on incarceration every year. So when you think about, it's a lot of money, but it's a drop in the bucket that could really change the future of this country, our entire policy culture, and really afford, I think, and stimulate entrepreneurship, innovation. And these are the kind of policies I wish Democrats would start focusing on. This notion actually had Republican roots, and I'd like to see them go big, not just on spending more and adding more to the existing policies, but to really reconsider, reinvent, and reimagine, what it means to pursue the American dream, and really think about the tragedy that could be forthcoming if we do not start managing our federal government operationally and fiscally quite differently. If Democrats adopted that plank, Tim, I really think it would be an unstoppable party. That is the one element that is really preventing a lot of independents and moderate Republicans from making that jump, because they don't have faith that we are a pro-business party, that we are one that takes fiscal responsibility seriously, And with the erosion of that consideration amongst Republicans, I think it's a grand opportunity. So that's my call to action for them.
Obviously concur on that. It's preaching to the choir. All right, what's next for you, Congressman? What's happening?
Well, Tim, yesterday I worked at a fast food restaurant for a series I call On the Job with Dean. The day before that, I was at the Mall of America. I joined the Nickelodeon dance team. And
you're living your best life, it sounds like to me.
So I got to tell you, never did I know what I was really missing. I'm giving thought to that right now, Tim. I want to make a difference. I'm going to invest my time in the public sector and increasing participation. We can't sustain democracy with only 1 in 10 Americans voting in primary elections. I want to work on gerrymandering. I want to expand ranked choice voting, and I want to inspire competition. So I'll be keeping a foot in public water somehow, and reconnecting with friends and family in the next few months, and hope to add value to a country that really deserves it and that has given me so much. And just in closing, I think I shared with you in my first visit with you that I lost my dad in Vietnam, and this job over the last 6 years has been a remarkable one. And when every time I pull out my voting card, I think of my predecessors in that very chamber taking votes on policies that would expand and afford education to young Americans that my father took advantage of because he had no money to go to college in the late 60s. So he did the ROTC program, he got educated. And the same people, made votes that ultimately would take his life in Vietnam. And we need to start attracting the best and brightest, most competent Americans on the right and left, make public service an honorable, reasonably compensated pursuit that attracts thoughtful progressives and thoughtful conservatives. So I want to spend my time trying to do that with young people, to inspire them to be police officers, firefighters, teachers, run for city council, school board, and Congress. If we can inspire people to participate, we're going to be just fine. But absent that vitamin of democracy, which is participation, we're going to have problems. So I'm going to spend my time doing that any way I can.
Well, in the midst of that, you're always welcome back here, Congressman Dean Phillips. I really appreciate it. Gave you a little bit too much of the business last time. I came around too late for your sake, but but earlier than some others.
Hey,
so
but
kudos
I
to you,
Tim. You did what I was asking for, which is you afforded me platform. It wasn't about whether people agreed with me. It was about affording platform. And when the Democratic machine or the Republican machine shuts down, suppresses platform for dissent, we are in trouble. So I want to say thank you to you and others with large followings and small that are simply giving space to those to make their case. You're doing the most important work in democracy. So thank you.
I appreciate that so much. Let's stay in touch.